So I'd like to publish a little bit more on Kandinsky, mostly to make his work a little bit more present, I think, but also to maybe have something to say about it after a little while. So let's see. I'm going to be moving into the chapter which is concerning the spiritual in art, Vasily Kandinsky, translated by MTH Sadler, and it's the chapter called The Language of Form and Color. And it probably won't do the whole chapter in one section because it's quite long. Let's go. We get a quote from Merchant of Venice, as in Shakespeare, which goes, "The man that hath no music in himself, nor is not moved with concord of sweet sounds, is fit for treasons, stratagems, and spoils. The motions of his spirit are dull as night, and his affections dark as Erebus. Let no such man be trusted. Mark the music." Musical sound acts directly on the soul and finds an echo there, because though to varying extents, music is innate in man. Quote, "Everyone knows that yellow, orange, and red suggest ideas of joy and plenty." That's Delacroix. These two quotations show the deep relationship between the arts, and especially between music and painting. Goethe said that painting must count this relationship her main foundation. And by this prophetic remark, he seems to foretell the position in which painting is today. This was again published a while ago. Quote, "She stands, in fact, at the first stage of the road by which she will, according to her own possibilities, make art an abstraction of thought, and finally arrive at purely artistic composition. Painting has two weapons at her disposal, color and form. Form can stand alone as representing an object, either real or otherwise, or as a purely abstract limit to a space or a surface. Color cannot stand alone. It cannot dispense with boundaries of some kind. A never-ending extent of red can only be seen in the mind. When the word red is heard, the color is evoked without definite boundaries. If such are necessary, they have deliberately to be imagined. But such red as is seen by the mind and not by the eye exercises at once a definite and an indefinite impression on the soul and produces spiritual harmony." Okay, so obviously this is quite relevant to, it's the episode 27 in the series on the world turned inside out, which is Corbin. So that stuff about the imagination and what he would call imaginal perception connected with art, architecture, harmony, light, metaphors involving mirrors, quite a lot of contemplation, and music. So it's sort of in the context of Corbin's work that I'm coming to the relevance of this sort of thing. So he's talking about the way that color can't sort of exist on its own, whereas form can. Whereas sort of the effect that these have on the soul produces a kind of inner harmony, could call. He talks about an indefinite impression on the soul. I say indefinite because in itself it has no suggestion of warmth or cold. Such attributes have to be imagined for it afterwards, as modifications of the original redness. I say definite as well, a definite impression on the soul, because the spiritual harmony exists without any need for such subsequent attributes of warmth or cold. An analogous case is the sound of a trumpet, which one hears when the word trumpet is pronounced. This sound is audible to the soul, without the distinctive character of a trumpet heard in the open or in a room, played alone or with other instruments, in the hands of a postilion, a huntsman, a soldier, or a professional musician. So basically what he's talking about is, in a sense, a kind of artistic perception, which is related to synesthesia, And it's the kind of way of perceiving or sensing, which is that when you name something, for example, redness or trumpet, then you perceive what that term, what that word means. So it's a way of understanding the word as uh, invocatory and evocatory. It evokes what it's supposed to refer to. The idea being that this is actually a kind of perception that we've been deeply cut off from to our great detriment. We're sort of existing in this sort of fallen form of sociology where our sort of, for example, thinking, feeling, sensing, and intuiting are sort of cut off from each other, split. And the whole point of the sort of, I would say, modern condition through people like Corbin is that through intentional practice, including but not limited to imaginal practice, work with the imagination, can help us to recover a deep sense of the interconnectedness, let's say, of our, in a way, perceptive faculties, to reintegrate them in a way which is coherent. I would otherwise say that this kind of practice, especially as relates to the soul and soul work, for me is far more relevant in the context of group work. Why? Because I think a lot of this stuff becomes far more, in a way, relevant or accessible in that context. I won't go on about that. I'll continue with Kandinsky, who says, but when red is presented in a material form, as in painting, it must possess two things. One, some definite shade of the many shades of red that exists, obviously, and two, a limited surface, divided off from the other colors, which are undoubtedly there. So he calls these subjective and objective conditions for red to be there. And he also talks about how the neighboring colors, they affect the shade of the red. I'd say it's quite tricky to grasp what he means. Basically, he's sort of talking about, he was earlier just talking about the word, for example, when a word evokes something. Again, we're sort of talking about form and color. And here he's sort of talking more about color. And now he's sort of saying that when a color is presented in material form rather than in an imaginal way, it has to literally have some of the shade of that color, but it's also separate, split off from the other colors nearby and those influences. Quote, this essential connection between color and form brings us to the question of the influences of form on color. Form alone, even though totally abstract and geometrical, has a power of inner suggestion. A triangle, whether it's acute or obtuse, angled or equilateral, quote, has a spiritual value of its own. In connection with other forms, this value may be somewhat modified, but remains in quality the same. The case is similar with a circle, a square, or any conceivable geometrical figure. So, to me, there are links here to obviously not only this is in, so I would say in the context of not only imaginal practice, but group practice involving soul work, involving creativity, involving sacred geometry, involving artistry, involving work with mandalas, then I would say, apart from just sort of pure painting, it becomes a lot more obvious sort of what he's getting at. He's talking about the different quote unquote spiritual qualities. It's hard to get what that means, that are associated with different shapes. And essentially, in a way, he's talking about the same thing as with color, is that it has sort of red, for example, has something of its own, but it also has something that's influenced by whatever is around it. And it's the same with these quote unquote shapes or forms, that they have their own kind of value, but they can be which can be modified in relation to other forms which are nearby. For example, he says that the angle at which the triangle stands and whether it's stationary or moving are of importance to its spiritual value. This fact is especially worthy of the painter's consideration. So I think what I would connect here is what I would take him to mean by spiritual value in a way is this is so reductive, but it's kind of like if we accept the idea that uh, spirituality is something that can involve deep intentional practice, I would say mystical experience and work involving the imagination. I would say especially on psychedelics, but that's just an aside. Then we have the idea that different kinds of shapes and different forms of the same kind of shape can sort of take us to different places, right? Take us different directions. And that's kind of what he's talking about. So now he wants to talk more about the relationship between form and color. And he says that the mutual influence between form and color is now more clear. And quote, a yellow triangle, a blue circle, a green square, or a green triangle, a yellow circle, a blue square, all these are different and have different spiritual values. Okay, quote, it's evident that many colors are hampered and even nullified in effect by many forms. Nullified in effect by many forms. On the whole, keen colors are well suited by sharp forms, for example, a yellow triangle, and soft, deep colors by round forms, for example, a blue circle. But it must be remembered that an unsuitable combination of form and color is not necessarily discordant, but may, with manipulation, show the way to fresh possibilities of harmony. Since colors and forms are well nigh innumerable, their combination and their influences are likewise unending. The material is inexhaustible. Okay, now he talks a little bit more about form. Let's see what he says. Form, in the narrow sense, is nothing but the separating line between surfaces of color. Okay, so he's literally talking about like when you look around at whatever objects are there, well, there are different colors, right? On a sort of, if you look at things in a sort of 2D way, then there are just different colors. And in a way, what form is the lines of separation between the different colors. He talks about this as the outer meaning of form. Then he says that it also has an inner meaning, quote, of varying intensity. He says it's literally never true that any form is meaningless and says nothing. Every form in the world says something, but its message often fails to reach us. And even if it does, full understanding is often withheld from us. So again, he's talking about, I would say, imaginal practice. I mean, he's not talking about that, but the point is that if we gain a capacity for deep sensitivity to what forms there are, then we can recognize the way that sort of everything speaks, if only we have the ears to listen to it. In this way, meaning is inherent in the forms which exist. The idea that forms are meaningless is literally nonsensical, nonsense, as in not sensing the meaning that is there. This was the culmination of that would be Sartre, Jean-Paul Sartre, who said nature is mute. This is such a deaf and blind position that it's actually horrifying how he got to that. Anyway, so we are just talking about the outer and the inner meanings of form, where the outer meaning was that a form is the kind of change from one color to another color, right? And form is the line between that. And he says that this outer form is the expression of its inner meaning. Quote, to use once more the metaphor of the piano, the artist is the hand which, by playing on this or that key, i.e., form, affects the human soul in this or that way. Quote, so it is evident that form harmony must rest only on a corresponding vibration of the human soul. And this is the second guiding principle of the inner need. So what he's saying, obviously, is that the different forms that we choose to use in artistry, they have a deep influence on us when we receive them, right? So there's a relationship of correspondence and sort of resonant frequency that he calls a vibration that goes on between the forms that we perceive and the condition or state of the soul. So this is what I would talk about in the context of axiological design. So how is it that the things around us have been designed? well, if they've been designed for sort of utilitarian purposes, well, what effect does that have on the soul? The idea being that if we can actually gain in our sensibility, literally in our sensitivity to what how things are impressing themselves upon us. The idea being that that's actually the things around us are sort of deeply unconsciously influencing us, and we're not sensitive to that. And he's talking about a kind of practice, I would say, or he's implying a kind of practice that can reveal that, and that we can start to be conscious of the way that the forms that we surround ourselves with condition our consciousness, and indeed the condition of our soul. Quote, the two aspects of form just mentioned define its two aims. The task of limiting surfaces, the outer aspect, is well performed if the inner meaning is fully expressed. The outer task may assume many different shapes, but it will never fail in one of two purposes. Quote, either form aims at so limiting surfaces as to fashion of them some material object, or form remains abstract, describing only a non-material spiritual entity. Such non-material entities with life and value as such are a circle, a triangle, a rhombus, a trapeze, etc. Many of them so complicated as to have no mathematical denomination. So he's talking about two different kinds of forms, right? The purposes of different forms. And look, we have all this, the idea that look at these objects, right? It has form. It doesn't only have form, it has more than form, but it does have form. And the idea, the purpose of the form of this bottle is to function as a bottle, right? So that I can drink from it. In the same way, the form of the sunglasses allows it to fulfill the purpose. This is the fulfillment of the purpose of the form of the sunglasses. And but there are other kinds of forms. I'm thinking of the book again. What the citations that are relevant here is the book Flatland, which is about a story involving triangles and circles and squares. And it's also the other book would be Quadrivium, the four classical liberal arts of number, geometry, music, and cosmology. And so, yeah, the second category is about hyper objects, I would call. So, in a way, you could call non-material phenomena or geometrical phenomena, in a way like Plato's forms or the archetypes, geometrical archetypes. Pythagoras talked about this stuff. So again, he was talking about two different kinds of forms, one of them sort of more abstract and non-material, and one of them sort of well, he's talking about two purposes that forms sort of fulfill. And one of them is in the sort of giving form to these abstract non-material quote unquote entities. And the other kind of purpose is to give form to literal material objects. And then he says, between these two extremes lie the innumerable forms in which both elements exist, with a preponderance either of the abstract or the material. Quote, these intermediate forms are at present the store on which the artist has to draw. Quote, purely abstract forms are beyond the reach of the artist at present. They are too indefinite for him. To limit himself to the purely indefinite would be to rob him of possibilities, to exclude the human element, and therefore to weaken his power of expression. So this is also a kind of self-reference. So he's saying that these intermediate forms at present are the store that the artist has to draw on. So at the moment, he's expressing himself in words, right? And there's a way that the words that he's using are designed to mediate between the sort of more abstract or non-material phenomena that he's pointing to, but he's also pointing from out of his words to literal material physical objects, right? I would also say that in the context of sort of group practice, intentional practice, these kinds of quote unquote abstract forms become more accessible. We become able to connect with such forms and draw them down into possibility. And this is what I would consider to be a huge part of the relevance of people like Kandinsky to that kind of context. Um, Not exactly art for art's sake, but more like art for society's sake, art for culture's sake. He continues, quote, "On the other hand, there exists equally no purely material form." Okay, so what he's saying is that everything is ultimately kind of intermediate in this way. Even though some of these forms are sort of more abstract, no, more non-material, they ultimately always participate in that which is human, that which is material. And similarly with purely material forms, they're always also, look, everything aspires, everything grows, everything evolves, everything is trying to be the best version of itself, if we can see it that way. There are no purely material forms. Quote, "A material object cannot be absolutely reproduced. For good or evil, the artist has eyes and hands, which are perhaps more artistic than his intentions, and refuse to aim at photography alone. Many genuine artists who cannot be content with a mere inventory of material objects seek to express the object by what was once called idealization, then selection, and which tomorrow will again be called something different." He says about this that the motive of idealization is to so beautify the organic form as to bring out its harmony and to rouse poetic feeling. Selection aims not so much at beautification as at emphasizing the character of the object by the omission of the non-essentials. So this is deeply phenomenological. It's reminding me of Proclus and his sympathy toward nature. Quote, the desire of the future will be purely the expression of the inner meaning. The organic form no longer serves as direct object, but as the human words in which a divine message must be written in order for it to be comprehensible to human minds. So this is a way of understanding artistic practice in a I would call phenomenological way, so as to I would say practice in such a way so as to reveal the inner essence of things, so as to disclose or unveil what things truly are, what message they really have to share, and what they are for themselves. And this is a way of understanding reality itself in terms of a kind of primordial language that has been written. He says, quote, "The impossibility and in art the uselessness of attempting to copy an object exactly, the desire to give the object full expression, are the impulses which drive the artist away from literal coloring to purely artistic aims." And that brings us to the question of composition. Okay, so now he wants to talk a bit about artistic composition. He says, pure artistic composition has two elements. One is the composition of the whole picture, and two is the creation of the various forms, which, by standing in different relationships to each other, decide the composition of the whole. Yeah, so essentially composition of wholes and parts. Quote, "Many objects have to be considered in the light of the whole, and so ordered as to suit this whole. Singly, they will have little meaning, being of importance only insofar as they help the general effect. These single objects must be fashioned in one way only, and this not because their own inner meaning demands that particular fashioning, but entirely because they have to serve as building material for the whole composition." Now he's going to give an example of this, and I'm going to share the. He wants to talk about this painting of Cézanne called Bathing Women. And he says, I just got it like that, right? It's not quite what I want. It's more like this one. Yeah, so he says about this, a good example is Cézanne's Bathing Women, which is built in the form of a triangle. See? Such building is an old principle which was being abandoned only because academic usage made it lifeless. But Cézanne has given it new life. He does not use it to harmonize his groups, but for purely artistic purposes. He distorts the human figure with perfect justification. Not only must the whole figure follow the lines of the triangle, but each limb must grow narrower from top to bottom. From bottom to top. Now he says about this painting that Raphael's Holy Family is an example of triangular composition used only for the harmonizing of the group without any mystical motive. Okay. So he says, yeah, so what he's talking about is the change in the sort of intention of using this kind of form in different artistic periods. So he's saying that in the the Renaissance with Raphael, right, there was a kind of motive for using this triangle that was sort of purely for the sake of harmonizing this little group here, and not for the sake of a kind of mystical or spiritual influence. Whereas with Cézanne, he does think that, and obviously Cézanne is much more recent, and so this is what allows him to say, quote, "So the abstract idea is creeping into art, although only yesterday it was scorned and obscured by purely material ideals. Its gradual advance is natural enough, for in proportion as the organic form falls back into the background, the abstract ideal achieves greater prominence." Okay. What more does he want to say about composition? So again, he's sort of talking about the sort of mutual influence of sort of materiality and the abstract, which is a sort of bottom up and top down dialectic in art, in composition particularly. And he says, but the organic form, which is like the natural material uh, sensory form, possesses all the same an inner harmony of its own, which may be either the same as that of its abstract parallel, thus producing a simple combination of the two elements, or totally different, in which case the combination may be unavoidably discordant. However diminished in importance the organic form may be, its inner note will always be heard. And for this reason, the choice of material objects is an important one. The spiritual accord of the organic with the abstract element may strengthen the appeal of the latter, or may destroy it. So what he's talking about essentially are the sort of relationships of harmony, correspondence, or resonance, not only between a piece of artwork and the human soul, but between the sort of organic and spiritual, or you could say natural, sensory, material, and abstract, spiritual, non-material aspects of different artworks. And he's saying that they can sort of either work together or work against each other in one composition. And so he says, quote, suppose a rhomboidal composition made up of a number of human figures. The artist asks himself, are these human figures an absolute necessity to the composition, or should they be replaced by other forms? And that without affecting the fundamental harmony of the whole. If the answer is yes, we have a case in which the material appeal directly weakens the abstract appeal. The human form must either be replaced by another object, which, whether by similarity or contrast, will strengthen the abstract appeal, or must remain a purely non-material symbol. Okay, so he gives another metaphor to try and explain this. What does he mean? So he says, once more, the metaphor of the piano. For color or form, a substitute object, every object has its own life. Meaning every color has its own life, every form has its own life, but every object has its own life, and therefore its own appeal. Man is continually subject to these appeals. But man is continually subject to these appeals. So this is a way of, again, pointing to imaginal practice. It's a way of revealing to the sort of unconscious undercurrents of living in this world that all these objects around us are pulling us unconsciously in different directions. Everything has a profound influence on us that we don't often account for or take account of. Correct. He says the results are often dubbed either sub or super consciousness, super conscious. So we're not present to this. Quote, nature, that is to say, the ever-changing surroundings of man, sets in vibration the strings of the piano, the soul, by manipulation of the keys, the various objects with their several appeals. So again, this is a way of regarding everything that surrounds us, to put it that way, is nature itself, and that the different qualities that everything around us has plays our soul as if it's a piano. Again, we see axiology, the way that our environments, what is around us, deeply influences who we are in ways that we don't appreciate. Quote, the impressions we receive, which often appear merely chaotic, consist of three elements: the impression of the color of the object, of its form, and of its combined color and form, i.e., of the object itself. About how we have this relationship between sort of the state of our soul in a kind of inner way, and the impressions upon that soul by objects and their form and their color. He says, at this point, the individuality of the artist comes to the front and disposes as he wills these three elements, meaning the form, the color, and both combined as the object. It's clear, therefore, that the choice of object, i.e., of one of the elements in the harmony of form, quote, must be decided only by a corresponding vibration in the human soul. And this is a third guiding principle of the inner need. So what he's talking about is a kind of design principle, which is that unless artists, and indeed all creative types, are able to contact, get in touch with the soul, then we create from a different place within us that doesn't yield the same kind of results. So he's saying that the choice of the objects that we use, and indeed I would say that the choice of what designs we create, are they coming from our souls or not? Quote, the more abstract is form, the more clear and direct is its appeal. In any composition, the material side may be more or less omitted in proportion as the forms used are more or less material, and for them substituted pure abstractions or largely dematerialized objects. Quote, the more an artist uses these abstracted forms, the deeper and more confidently will he advance into the kingdom of the abstract. Quite. And after him will follow the gazer at his pictures, who also will have gradually acquired a greater familiarity with the language of that kingdom. So essentially, he's saying that the choice the artists make, whether to sort of emphasize more the abstract or to emphasize more of the concrete and in a way the natural, has a deep influence on us because it guides our perception. It not only guides the artist more deeply in that direction, but it guides those who look at art, right, more deeply toward that which is abstract or more deeply toward that which is, let's say, natural. Again, we see the profound importance, for example, of our conditioning environments, depending on not only from which place we design and create, but which direction that takes us, right? Well, it's going to deeply change. There are all these feedback loops that are going on where, for example, if our conditioning environments are coming from an abstract place, well, it's going to take us into an even more abstract direction. Continues, quote, must we then abandon utterly all material objects and paint solely in abstractions? The problem of harmonizing the appeal of the material and the non-material shows us the answer to this question. Quote, as every word spoken rouses an inner vibration, so likewise does every object represented. To deprive oneself of this possibility is to limit one's powers of expression. That is, at any rate, the case at present. Right, so he's talking about the way that if we go up toward greater abstraction, not only in our philosophy but also in our artistry, then we actually become not only blind, we become desensitized to the way that objects can influence us, to the way that they can impact us. And he thinks about this as limiting our powers of expression. So there's a way that not only every word, but every object can, quote, rouse an inner vibration within us, quote unquote, influence the soul. And we sort of it's kind of like a desert. If we go towards abstraction, we're losing touch with, I would say, the origins of life, with the source of life, and in a way, vibrancy and vitality that material forms express. But besides this answer to the question, there is another. So again, he was talking about right relationship between sort of abstraction and sensation in a way, non-material and material form. Quote, so there's another answer, and one which art can always employ to any question beginning with must, as in, must we abandon all material objects? Quote, there is no must in art because art is free. Okay, don't really like that answer, but anyway, I'll continue. So he says, with regard to the second problem of composition, so sorry, that was we were just talking about sort of the first problem of composition, which is the composition of the whole picture. And now he wants to talk about the second problem, which is the creation of various forms, which is sort of the composition of different parts, these forms which together compose the whole. Okay, so he says, with regard to the second problem of composition, the creation of the single elements which are to compose the whole, quote, it must be remembered that the same form in the same circumstances will always have the same inner appeal. Only the circumstances are constantly varying. It results that 2 points. One, the ideal harmony alters according to the relation to other forms of the form which causes it. So he's talking about the way that depending what elements are present and depending on the circumstances of those elements, then the quote unquote the ideal harmony is different. So there's a way that the ideal harmony is something sort of adaptive. He also says, two, even in similar relationship, a slight approach to or withdrawal from other forms may affect the harmony. Okay, we'll continue. Nothing is absolute. Form composition rests on a relative basis, depending on one, the alterations in the mutual relations of forms one to another, and two, the alterations in each individual form, down to the very smallest. So he's basically talking about the sort of the relativity of harmony in a way, like the way that harmony sort of exists as a result of the relationships between different forms which are themselves variable. So not only the relationships are variable, the forms themselves are variable, but this influences the sort of the kinds of harmony that result in a way. So he says, quote, every form is as sensitive as a puff of smoke. The slightest breath will alter it completely. This extreme mobility makes it easier to obtain similar harmonies from the use of different forms than from repetition of the same form. Though, of course, an exact replica of a spiritual harmony can never be produced. So a little bit more here. He says, so long as we're susceptible only to the appeal of a whole composition, this fact is of mainly theoretical importance. But when we become more sensitive by a constant use of abstract forms, which have no material interpretation, it will become of great practical significance. Okay, so what he's talking about is the different kinds of consciousness that derive from sort of sensitivity to wholes or sensitivity to parts. So there's a way that we are susceptible to the whole of a composition. And I wouldn't just talk about artwork here. I mean, he is talking about artwork, right? But there's a way that whatever the whole situation is, right? Whatever the whole conditioning environment is, deeply impacts us. But then he's saying that there's a different kind of sensitivity, which is more a sensitivity to forms themselves, like particular forms. And he feels that this kind of sensitivity, which is more of a kind of it's a sensitivity to the abstract parts in a way, the forms, the different, you could call shapes, but it's not quite shapes, it's forms that make up the whole. And he feels that this will result in a certain kind of practical significance. And so he's talking about the way that when our art becomes more abstract, and when in a way we meditate on those abstractions and the parts that comprise those kinds of artworks, the partial forms, that this can develop or cultivate our sensitivity, I would say, to the way that the different elements, literally the different forms in the quote unquote conditioning environment are affecting us. So he's talking about the capacity to, through artistic practice, develop or cultivate a certain kind of discernment, a certain kind of awareness of our susceptibility, not only to the whole condition, the whole environment, but to particular parts, particular forms. Tricky, tricky, tricky. He says, and so as art becomes more difficult, meaning more abstract, its wealth of expression in form becomes greater and greater. At the same time, the question of distortion in drawing falls out and is replaced by the question how far the inner appeal of the particular form is veiled or given full expression. And once more, the possibilities are extended for combinations of veiled and fully expressed appeals suggest new leitmotifs in composition. Okay, so I've got a couple more paragraphs here and then I'll stop because it's so dense, right? Very dense. He says, without such development as this, form composition is impossible. To anyone who cannot experience the inner appeal of form, whether material or abstract, such composition can never be other than meaningless. Apparently, aimless alterations in form arrangement will make art seem merely a game. Sorry, apparently aimless alterations in form arrangement will make art seem merely a game. So once more, we are faced with the same principle, which is to set art free, the principle of the inner need. Okay, so he's talking about why it's important that art be free, basically. And he's saying that it's important so that there's a way that he was talking about in the earlier episodes in here, he was talking about the sort of spiritual aim of art, that it's not aimless, that it has a spiritual kind of direction. And there's a way that he feels that to set art free is to set art free to pursue that spiritual direction. So the aimlessness in art would be seen as not freedom. It would be seen as the opposite. I think I've got that right. And so in that context of the talking about the freedom of art, he's been talking about the importance of sensitivity to form and the relationship between sensitivity to not only wholes and parts in terms of forms, but also abstract and sensory or more material. And he was talking about getting them into a sort of feedback relationship. Each of those dialectics. He says, quote, when features or limbs for artistic reasons are changed or distorted, men reject the artistic problem and fall back on the secondary question of anatomy. But on our argument, this secondary consideration does not appear, only the real artistic question remaining. These apparently irresponsible but really well-reasoned alterations in form provide one of the storehouses of artistic possibilities. Okay. Two more paragraphs just to finish this. This one is a little bit more rich. He says, the adaptability of forms their organic but inward variations, their motion in the picture, their inclination to material or abstract, their mutual relations, either individually or as parts of a whole. Further, the concord or discord of the various elements of a picture, the handling of groups, the combinations of veiled and openly expressed appeals, the use of rhythmical and unrhythmical, of geometrical or non-geometrical forms, their contiguity or separation. All these things are the material for counterpoint in painting. So I would talk about all this as themes of literally group management, literally like a group of people, right? So like we're talking about the adaptability of different forms and how they vary organically and they vary inwardly, sort of in their essence. They vary in how they move, the kinds of movement. They vary in whether they incline to material or abstract. We talk about the relationships between different forms, obviously. We could talk about them as individual forms or as parts of a whole. The presence of concord and discord, different subgroups, I would call. The combinations of it being veiled or openly expressed and the different appeals that go along with both. Rhythm and its lack, geometry and its lack, contiguity or separation. All these, I would say, different themes that show up in literally group practice. And that's what I think of that as the true, in a way, the best context for artistic work anyway. Correct. But so long as color is excluded, such counterpoint is confined to black and white. Color provides a whole wealth of possibilities of her own, and when combined with form, yet a further series of possibilities. All these will be expressions of the inner need. Okay, so again, he's talking about the inner need of art to be free. And I'm going to pause it there because that was enough, I would say. And I'll come back to the next part.